vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Țări pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. E pentru că pe lume partidul s-a dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
костяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this, the latest in our Q&A and discussion programs, coming to you live from an undisclosed location. And tonight we're going to be dealing, first of all, with a few issues that have come up in relation to BRICS and the general decline of US imperialism. So going to be talking about that first, then going to be taking questions from the chat. So be sure to submit a few on anything that takes your fancy in there. And we've got a few questions to address on email as well. So first up, let's just deal with this, the various threats from Trump that have been bellowed towards the BRICS countries, or the BRICS as an organization, over the last few days, and Trump threatening India over their purchases of Russian oil, Trump trying to threaten China again and miserably failing. And also the the attempt to describe BRICS as a threat to the dollar system and therefore something that needs to be pressured away with the constant threat of tariffs and sanctions, etc., on BRICS countries. None of this is going to work, by the way. The Indians, for all that they have been playing under the Modi premiership and arguably before that as well, but the Indian bourgeoisie has been trying to play a double game, trying to, on the one hand, maintain their historically positive relationship with Russia, on the other, leaning towards the US in the hope of gaining from the fact that the US bourgeois has been looking for ways to circumvent their need to outsource production to China in particular, and the Indians have been posing as the next best alternative. Cheap labor and lots of it, and the willingness of the Indian state to act as a labor disciplining mechanism on behalf of the U.S. capitalists. Now, this of course puts the position in BRICS in the Indian position in BRICS in an interesting light, because the Indian government is trying to face in two directions at once. Now, what's becoming obvious with the threats issued by Trump, and let's be clear here, Trump, in the way that he has made the threats against the Indians, might be particularly crude, but this confrontation or this beginning of a confrontation would have begun regardless of who was president. Like, if Kamala Harris had won, she would be giving some nauseating speech right now about drawing upon her Indian ancestry, probably whilst wearing a sari, and proclaiming that India must always historically side with the side of freedom, or something nauseating like that. And the way in which the Indian ruling class and the Indian state has interacted with US imperialism over the last 5 to 6 years or so has been interesting. They, of course, joined the Quad, which is a specifically anti-China alliance. Those of you who know anything about the history between India and China will know that there is something of a tragic development there in the early 1960s. Prior to the war of the early 1960s, they had been, for a time at least, relatively close allies. Of course, India had significant ties to the Soviet Union, and has also had ties to China as well. It's arguably one of the other disastrous impacts of the Soviet-Chinese split, which again was 90-odd% of which was the fault of of Khrushchev and his clique. But the hostility that emerged between China and the Soviet Union, promoted by the Khrushchev gang, arguably made the relations between India and China significantly worse, or contributed to that. Now, there was a war in the early 1960s which saw India lose quite badly, and had to make territorial concessions, including in the disputed region of Kashmir. And since then, relations between the two have been troubled, to say the least. And there remains, to this day, border disputes between India and China, which thus far are being negotiated. But the idea of weaponizing these disputes and weaponizing India against China is something which will be very appealing to US imperialism. And there are those within the Indian bourgeoisie who would at least go along with this for a while. And the whole question of like where India goes now is very interesting. So Trump makes these threats, which is all about India continuing to purchase Russian oil, and the fact that they have not stopped doing so over the last 3 years. And essentially what they do is that the Indian oil company, Indian state oil company, takes Russian oil, puts it through a refining process, stamps Indian oil on it, and then resells it on the world market. And this leads to a decent income stream for the Russian oil production, and circumvents the sanctions. It's part of how sanctions have been circumvented. And the US imperialists have wanted this to stop for quite some time. And Trump, of course, in his now absolutely desperate attempt to try and place pressure on the Russian government to try and get them to agree to his rather shitty deal that he's been pushing, which, just to remind you, involves largely keeping the Kiev regime in place, which is a strategic priority for US imperialism. Now, the Trump, he's been trying various different things to try and put pressure on the Russians. He's been trying to, that's what was lay behind his blow up at Medvedev. Oh, I'm gonna deploy the nuclear submarines right over to near Russia. Chances are, by the way, that the Russians know exactly where the American nuclear missile capable submarines are at any one given time. These things are constantly tracked by each side. So it's a bit of a ridiculous threat. But so that's part of it. The Kaliningrad threat from some senior NATO officers and other think tanks is also part of it. It's also a completely ludicrous threat which will never be carried through. The talk of additional sanctions is also part of it, and the maneuvers with India about Russian oil are also part of it. As is, by the way, and this is news I'm going to be covering in more depth on the latest Decline and Fall episode, but I'll mention it here. The Russian SVR, that's the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, is claiming, and I think with a good degree of believability, that the British are plotting some kind of sabotage operation against the Russian, what they call it, the Russian Shadow Fleet. It's ships that carry Russian oil, often not they're not flagged with the colors of Russia, but then again that goes for a lot of British shipping as well, and American. They're often flagged with the colors of Liberia, Panama, or other tiny countries where it's more advantageous financially to register your ship. But the SVR are claiming, and again, I think there is, knowing what we do about the way the British try to wage wars, I think there's validity to this. The SVR are claiming that the British are getting a Ukrainian sabotage squad ready to try and conduct some kind of terrorist act against the Russian shipping, and that this is part of their big plan to put pressure on the Russians again, or to try and find a justification to carry out more armed interceptions of Russian oil tankers. Now, I don't think this plan is going to go anywhere because the Russians know about it and have leaked it. And so whatever the British were planning, I don't think is going to go ahead. But it is kind of typical of the things that the idiots in the British Ministry of Defence would think up. So again, to go back to the point, the Indians turned down Trump's, denied Trump's request, quote unquote request, and did so on the basis that it goes against the current business model they're pursuing. But it does raise questions because the Indians want to keep the door open to the Russians and to the BRICS, and they also want to keep investment from the US coming in. Now, it raises the question as to, well, how long can they play this game? How long can the Indian bourgeois continue to face in two directions at the same time, towards the Russians and towards the US? It does raise the question of are the Americans prepared to make greater and greater threats, exert greater and greater pressure on the Indians, including potentially cutting off investment, which would train wreck a lot of the ideas percolating in the US about replacing China with India if the US political leaders are going to issue a series of threats against the Indians, then that will potentially derail the idea of using India as the new China. So Indians turned Trump down. The Chinese, predictably, basically politely told Trump to fuck off when he said, "I demand that you, Mr. Xi, stop buying that terrible Russian oil and stop talking about Epstein. Why is everybody in China talking about Epstein?" The way in which this plays out is going to be interesting because it has obviously a knock-on impact on BRICS. BRICS, of course, is not a finished product. It is an international organization which has, of course, grown significantly in recent years. It has been pushed forward, powered forward by the Russian special military operation. And but it is by no means a perfect solution, because you have a series of countries in there with wildly different systems, some of which are capitalist, some of which are non-capitalist, and some of which are very much bound up with the US imperial system, some of which less so. And you're going to get a series of contradictions playing out here, because you have the US imperial system still containing a significant amount of power, because it's still able to move around a significant amount of capital. So that's part of the reason why the Saudis, for instance, are sort of in BRICS and sort of not, because again, they're trying to face in two directions at the same time. How long that will be sustainable is a very interesting question. Now, it is reported that the Indians were blocking maneuvers towards a BRICS currency, and towards BRICS taking on a greater role in world affairs, essentially, due to the fact that this was not something that the Americans wanted to see. So will that remain the case? It's an interesting one. We don't know at this stage. We'll have to see how things play out inside India itself. It's also interesting because this is tied up very much with the fate of the BJP in India and their path forward, because they were sold very much by the British ruling class. When Modi first came to power, he was brought over here and taken to Wembley Stadium to give it like he was playing a gig there. I remember him being introduced by that horrendous, sweaty, cellophane-wrapped, repulsive sausage, David Cameron, a man who infamously was always portrayed by the old Guardian columnist Steve Bell as a sort of a condom stuffed with like raw sausage meat. Now, the reason for this, of course, the reason why the British imperialists would give the Indian Prime Minister such a big show of a greeting, partly because there's a significant vote in this country which is of Indian ancestry. There's quite a lot of communities in Britain who are of Indian ancestry. There's a significant number of these people who are upper petty bourgeois or even lower bourgeois. Those are the kind of people that the Conservative Party and the Labour Party want to get hold of vote-wise. That's part of it. But also it's because the British always hold out the expectation that they can, if they can embed themselves within the Indian institutions and bring over members of the Indian ruling class to give them a good old-fashioned British education, that India can continue to be, or can be returned to, shall we say, an element of British control. I mean, that's been a dream of British policymakers since 1947, an Indian independence. This is something that they've wanted to do. This is why they went out of their way to big up Modi. They thought this was going to be the guy who gave them the way forward. But it would appear that the relations inside India class relations inside India are a little bit more complicated, as is India's political alignment. There are elements within India that wish to almost play a comprador role with regard to the US and the US-led imperial bloc. There's other elements in the Indian bourgeoisie who want to pursue an independent line. And as with every other country you analyze, you have to see the sort of contradictions and the twists and the turns in the lines taken by government as the playing out of tensions inside the ruling class inside the country itself, particularly a country like India. So Trump's pressure on Modi, which has so far failed, is an interesting point, potential point of departure. Whether that increases Indian engagement with building BRICS as a new set of international institutions is going to be interesting to see. The power of the US is still significant. Their ability to move capital around is still significant. And there is still a section of the Indian bourgeoisie which is very much tied to both Britain and the United States. So we will have to see how this shakes out. But it's interesting that Trump has resorted to threats. And it's interesting also that certainly a part of the Indian bourgeoisie regards the relationship with the Russians as non-negotiable. So we'll have to see where that goes. It's also worth noting that, as I said earlier, what I refer to as the BRICS conundrum is, well, how does BRICS develop when you have wildly different systems inside of it, wildly different countries with very much different international alignments? I mean, one of the reasons why, or the primary reason why Venezuela was blocked from being a candidate member for BRICS was the objections of that treacherous rat Lula in Brazil. Again, reflecting not just his, deeply compromised social democratic politics, but also the state of play in Brazil itself, where essentially the Lula government only just managed to get only just managed to beat Bolsonaro. And he's very much aware of this fact. And there are significant divisions again within the Brazilian ruling class. There is a section of the Brazilian ruling class which is just utterly comprador in nature and utterly slavishly devoted to serving US imperialism. There's another section which wants to develop its relations, particularly with China. The Brazilian bourgeois do an awful lot of business with the Chinese and also want to pursue a more independent line. The development of that is going to be an interesting conflict because, again, Lula denied or blocked Venezuelan membership of BRICS because, of course, this is something that would displease the Americans, and therefore the comprador section of the Brazilian ruling class would have been, I would say, militantly opposed to it. And Maduro's rather justifiably angry response gave away the ongoing tensions between the two countries. But it must be said also that this is something that will probably be resolved in time. I would imagine that getting Venezuela into BRICS will be certainly a priority for Russia, given that they're a key ally. And I would say also China as well, given that the Chinese have made significant investments now in Venezuela. So, and yes, Bolsonaro is under house arrest, as Jerry correctly points out in the chat. I'd also point out, just to draw off something that Marius has just contributed in the chat, Lula and the Brazilian left, not only influenced by Soros, but like all of the worst ideas and the worst elements of like the Anglo-American left, which is why you have you have some of the worst people in like so-called independent media, like worshipping Lula as if he was the second coming of Christ. Because unfortunately, in countries like Brazil, the power of like the Western social democrats is quite significant, and so thus the social democratic delusions there are very strong, fed also by the fact that Brazilian capitalism is becoming relatively successful in the world, and hence why Lula, in 20 years ago, when he was first in office, engaged in the kind of shady imperial games with the Bush administration, involving, of course, Brazil sending a contribution to the occupation force that occupied Haiti 20 years ago under the command of the Bush administration. So this is the nature of Lula and his movement, prepared to cooperate, collaborate with imperialism, prepared to contribute to the suppression of a small nation like Haiti. So it's no wonder that the pro-imperial Western left fucking loves this guy, is it? You know. So contradictions in BRICS is something that we will return to, and we'll return to that in future episodes. Right. So let's get going with the questions and the greetings then. So Marius, hello to you. You point out that the painting in the intro screen was by Thomas Cole, and that's part of his Rise and Fall of Empire series. It's 4 paintings that Cole, by the way, who was born in the northwest of England, was born very close to where I grew up, but emigrated to the United States. So he painted this series of portraits, which I think is entitled "The Course of Empire," which I think is a brilliant series of. So it's 5 in total, which, you know what, I'm gonna do a screen share so you can see them all. So if you just hold on a moment, I will. So here we go. These are all painted in the early 19th century by Thomas Cole. And this is the first. This is from 1836. It's the first in the series. This is called The Savage State. And if you look here, you can see what you have here towards the bottom of the screen, where the little magnifying glass is going. You can see like a deer type creature being chased by a primitive hunter, and in the far distance you can see like a primitive ancient village. I mean, the whole works, the series of works, they're inspired, they're not a direct representation of Rome. That I would say they're more like a sort of combination of Greece and Rome, and probably bits of Byzantium as well in terms of what he's representing. So that's the first one. That's the Savage State. This is the Arcadian or pastoral state. You can see there's a stone circle, looks a lot like Stonehenge in the distance. There are people doing sort of vaguely more civilized things. There's people walking under the trees there. There's agriculture taking place, like farming, small scale farming. There's like smoke in the distance. So this is like the emergence of humankind from the primitive barbarism into a more slightly higher form, away from hunting and gathering and towards sort of organized agriculture. Here is the consummation. It's titled, and again, if you look at like what he's putting together here in this very, I would say, almost gaudy picture. This is my least favorite of all of them, by the way. This you see like gold painted ships, statues, everything is marble. You can see some decadent Greco-Roman aristocrats lounging there, and you can see that this is meant to represent the high point of Rome or Greece, and this is before the fall. And the fall, of course, is always more interesting. So here we go. This is the one I use as the background sometimes in the Decline and Fall show and in the countdown. If you look, you can see like it's you can see the artist's name there on the base of that gigantic statue, and you can see that this is very much, well, you know, I think it's basically a standard night out in Manchester or Birmingham, to be honest. But this is the fall. You can see the magnificent buildings wreathed in smoke. You can see like a panicked horde being chased by like barbarian invaders. There's ships on fire. There's a woman trying to escape, presumably a man who looks a little bit like Harvey Weinstein there. You can see death and destruction all around. It's from the high point, we have now got to devastation. And the smoke, one thing about this picture I particularly like is the way he blends in the smoke with the stormy sky above, giving the whole thing like literally a feel of an apocalypse. And then you get desolation, which is, again, like if you've ever been to or looked at pictures of the way that Rome fell apart over the years. This is or like or ancient Italy fell apart into literally like petty feuding states for a long time, or different bits of other empires. The way in which he's represented, like the ruins here, is quite familiar, because if you look at the entries on just on history or standard history websites, where they've got like representations of the way that the ancient buildings were treated in like Middle Ages Rome, you can see that what happened was that the marble was literally stripped away by like people in the Renaissance period. So like these magnificent ancient buildings, which often survived the fall of Rome, were stripped away by later empires. And this isn't my favorite of them all. I think my favorite is probably, of course, the fall, but I do like this one as well. There is a calmness to it, and Cole, he probably gives away his sort of rather pessimistic inclinations about human civilization, and you can this restoration of nature seems to be something that the artist very much approves of. Like you can see the green ivy creeping up the ruined column. Nature is reclaiming what man sought to master. Of course, this isn't a view that I, as a Marxist, share, but expressed by an artist, it can be somewhat interesting. So do look that up. A very interesting series of paintings there, very much worth your time. I will carry on now and talk about various other questions. So hello to Thomas Wolf, Victor, Jasmine, Vera, Comrade Davy, Mogman Dog, David Ball, Callum Roche, Potted Rodent, Albert in Croydon, Robert in Staten Island, Jerry, Will Johnson, Daniel joining us from Somerset. Good evening, comrade. S.W. Heister, Kawa Justiniano. It's always been them. That flag is a Irish Republican flag behind me, although I see Callum's answered that one. Right. Jay Cobran says, or asks rather, if the USSR supported decolonization, why did Stalin sign UN recognition 181 in 1947 Palestine partition? I also understand it was the first signatory. Well, first of all, Stalin didn't sign it. The Soviet government did. So let's stop that. This sort of feeding into the anti-Stalin paradigm here. Look, I've explained this before, but I will go into it again. There is never any one individual reason why a particular event happens. So bear that in mind first. There is a series of things going on here with regard to the recognition of the Israeli state. First of all, you have the Zionist movement, which in no way should have been able to do this because they were complicit in the Holocaust due to their collaboration with the Nazis, but they very effectively used the sympathy for the Jewish people to promote the idea of a Jewish homeland, and that had a certain impact, even in like communist circles. Unfortunately, it also is the case that a number of people, Soviet Jews who'd been fighters in the Red Army, did take up the chance to emigrate to the state of Israel. So there was also, by this time, unfortunately, there was a pro-Zionist element to the CPSU. not the majority by any means, and they didn't have the majority until all the way into the later 80s, but they were there. And so there was also within the Soviet leadership at the time, there was present within that, as we've talked about last night, the revisionist trend was becoming increasingly powerful by 1947, 48. And a big part of what they wanted was to stop the developing hostility from the US, the British, and the French towards the USSR, and to do so by essentially capitulating to them on a number of issues. I would say that that had a certain influence as well. Also, the Zionists rather cleverly deployed their left wing, and they did have a left wing back then, similar to imperialist social democracy, really. But the left wing of the Zionists made overtures to the USSR, claiming that they would be a reliable ally to the USSR in West Asia against the British. And this was something which some in the Soviet leadership bought into, because there had been, towards the end of British Mandate Palestine, clashes between Zionist terror gangs and the British Army. This is after decades of collaboration between the two. So it was a brief interruption. They went the resolution that the questioner mentions that went to the UN was also about, yes, recognizing the state of Israel, but also it was meant to establish a Palestinian state alongside it. It's the same shit plan that still exists to this day. And so what the USSR signed up to was the recognition of the Zionist state and the Palestinian state alongside of it, which the actions of not just the Zionists, so they were the principal movers in this, but also the British, via their Jordanian puppets, essentially kiboshed the plan for a Palestinian state entirely, because what was then called Transjordania took control of what's called the West Bank, and that and the combination of that and the mass expulsions carried out by the Zionists meant that a Palestinian state was a no-go. So the thing that the USSR voted for was never actually brought into existence. Needless to say, though, that was a terrible mistake. It was a sign of degeneration within the Soviet leadership. Many pin the blame on Stalin, but it must be said that by the later 1940s, when this was happening, Stalin, according to Grover Furr and others, and this is something I've come to believe myself, was in a minority in the Politburo. So the revisionists were already had the majority there. So a lot of the decisions which the Trotskyites claim, Stalin did this, Stalin did that. No, Stalin as general secretary represented the position, the considered position of the political bureau and the wider party through its various different processes. He didn't just make stuff up out of thin air. So and also, I would say, after the First War, the USSR switched to being a reliable ally of the Arab National Liberation Forces all the way up to the 1980s. It's arguable that they made some mistakes in that as well, particularly like placing all their bets on NASA was probably not a good idea. Allying closely with Saddam Hussein was also not a good idea. But they were on the side of Arab liberation until like the middle 1980s with the wretched rat Gorbachev. So those are the reasons I think that this happened. Doesn't excuse it. It shows that there were certain problems in the Soviet leadership at the time. But to use it as the Trotskyites do to claim that this is somehow the proof that the USSR was never anti-imperialist, that's ridiculous. Okay. Greetings to Ben. Albert says the Indians want to maintain the border from the time of the British India. These borders are the McMahon line in the eastern section, the Johnson-Ardagh line in the western sector. Interesting. Daniel says, in the case of small landlords who own a handful of properties and don't rely entirely on them for income, do you think they should be entitled to compensation post-revolution? Well, it depends how many properties, doesn't it? I mean, are you a small landlord if you own like 5 houses? Doesn't sound particularly small to me. Small in comparison to like BlackRock, yes, but there's absolutely no reason why somebody needs more than like one home. I mean, in the Soviet period, like the people had like one home and a small cabin to escape to, dacha, at the weekend. Like, so why do people need more than one property? To answer Daniel's question directly, though, like I go back to the old formula, which is compensation on the basis of proven need. So if somebody's like, on their ass skint and actually would be like thrown into poverty by having like their assets confiscated, then you compensate according to their needs. And also, you don't leave people like literally sinking into poverty anyway. The aim of expropriating landlords and the major property owners is to ensure that everybody has a baseline of decent living under which they do not fall. So that's the formula I would use, like compensation on the basis of proven need. So like whenever somebody used to suggest like renationalizing like the utility companies, for instance, you always got media, bourgeois press starts screaming about what about the small investors? Well, the small investors own like a tiny amount of the privatized utility companies. So you can say that it's somebody who's got like a bunch of shares which they draw a dividend from, and that's their only means of income, and they can demonstrate a need there, then an amount of compensation can be paid. But for the big institutional investors, you don't pay them anything at all. You just take it. Same is true for properties and things like that. SW Haster asks, do you think that BRICS or the Global South needs a military alliance? Do you think they will succeed without an alliance that would counterbalance NATO? Interesting question. It's going to be very difficult to reach a point where, given the current balance of forces, you would get like a unified military command in the way that NATO has. And also bear in mind, NATO without the US isn't anything. I mean, it's like a bunch of fucking British admirals with no ships talking crap. So it would be a potentially useful development, I would say, given that they're not going to get any peace out of the US imperialists and their allies anytime soon. Bear in mind that the Russians can very rarely get the consensus needed to do some kind of interventions with the CSTO. There's been like one in 20 plus years, and that was in Kazakhstan to, I would say, probably push the Nazarbayev clique out of power and secure Tokayev in power. That's probably what that was about. So they haven't they haven't used it at any other time. I mean, there was the potential to use it in the defense of Armenia, but the Armenian government itself never submitted a request, and we all know why now. There's other military alliances as well, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does have a military cooperation aspect to it. That's why you got Chinese troops marching through Belarus and doing like joint training exercises with the Belarusians. So there's that element as well. And so there are different military aspects to these overlapping alliances that do exist now. You're also seeing, of course, that the Russians have their own arrangements, particularly with the DPRK. So hence why the DPRK armed forces were deployed to defend the Kursk region. And of course, that brings them a certain amount of benefits as well. So there are these various different aspects of military alliances taking shape. It will take time before that becomes a unified thing. It took a significant amount of time to get an Iranian and Russian agreement over defense was elusive. So because the Iranians wouldn't agree to it due to the influence of the comprador element in Iran. That might change now. I believe that they have received more air defense systems from Russia, and some say China as well. Though the Chinese part of that story I haven't been able to confirm. So to get to the point where you would have a military alliance, I think we're still a ways away from that yet. We may get to it due to the fact that the relentless hostility of the US imperialists pushes certainly Russia, China, and Iran in that direction. To answer Jerry's question, there used to be there used to be, of course, the Warsaw Pact, which was formed in 1955. Several years, in fact, 6 years after NATO was formed, and that, according to the research I've done on it, was quite an effective military organization. We may go back and do something on the Warsaw Pact in the future, but there also used to be SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which was the Southeast Asian version of NATO. That did exist for a while. I think that went out of existence 40 years ago or more, by the mid 1970s. But there used to be several. The Warsaw Pact, of course, was dissolved by the Soviet revisionist traitors, and who were the same people who allowed the US imperialists to run riots in Eastern Europe. So I think it will happen eventually. It won't look exactly like NATO because, of course, a key part of the whole BRICS arrangement is the fact that they all value and their sovereignty and independence, and probably wouldn't be willing at this stage to form like a joint operations command or something that would integrate. See, if you look at why, look at how the NATO is organized. NATO is organized under a joint command of particularly like America, Britain being the leading parts of that. And the way that the NATO forces are supposedly structured, I mean, this is in theory, it's not been tested in practice, is that all of the different armies can operate alongside each other in a unified structure. I don't think you're going to get that overnight with China and Iran, for instance, or even Russia and China, but you are going to get an increasing amount of military integration. It'll be interesting to know how much military cooperation there's been between, say, China and Russia during the special military operation. It's probably been quite extensive. My guess would be that the Chinese have a permanent observation group of officers inside the Russian military headquarters who have been observing the special military operation from the start. That would be my guess. It's also pretty much confirmed that they've got officers from the army of the DPRK in there learning. So these things are developing, and they develop under the whip hand of US imperialism. The more US imperialism ups the pressure, the more that its non-imperialist opponents are forced to cooperate. Right, moving on. Is Ibrahim Traore a genuine anti-imperialist hope? Asks Callum. That would be that's correct. They are. Well, he is, I would say. So the way I would say, I know the spat with Kemi Badnoch was good. I haven't seen that. I'll have to look it up. Traore represents a certain continuity with the days of Thomas Sankara. His emergence shows the fact that French imperialism had worked itself into an absolute dead end in Burkina Faso and other places. And the fact that you have Traore, Assimi Goïta, and Abdurrahman Chiane, the three leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Chad, Mali and Niger that have emerged, all came from the military, and all of whom I think went through French and some of them American military training during the War on Terror period. Shows that what was happening there was that there was a process of radicalization going on in the inside the militaries of these countries, because what the more intelligent officers saw was that in each of these cases, the French took like Burkinabe, Mali, and Nigerian military officers, gave them training, committed French forces to supposedly battling these Al-Qaeda type organizations. And all of these officers realized at different points that, hang on, we're not actually doing anything that actually fights Al-Qaeda here. That seemingly whatever happens, the Al-Qaeda type operation keeps on going. And so each of them reached the correct conclusion that this is a setup. This is a device put in play by the French and probably the Americans as well, never rule out British involvement also, that is designed to keep us subjugated and justify an always ever-present French military occupation. So what you have essentially is a process whereby, like, the officers in these armies got radicalized, and in Traore's case, there was the living example of the Sankara years, for all the flaws that existed in that time, and he's very much run with it. And I think if you look at what they're doing in Burkina Faso, the mass construction projects, the mobilization of the population to participate in, like, building highways and other forms of infrastructure, as well as, of course, the mobilization of the population to defend this revolutionary process. What you're seeing really is a sort of African expression of some of the things that have been done in places like Nicaragua and Venezuela, with a particularly Sankarist flavoring to it. So yes, I would say that these are genuine examples of anti-imperialist fighters. There's a strong socialist element, particularly to the Burkinabe experiment, shall we say, the Burkinabean revolution, the land of the upright men, which is what Sankara renamed what was once known as Upper Volta. So they're still faced with a lot of challenges. The French, the British, and the Americans are going to fund and arm all these, like, reactionary jihadist fighters. But I think that particularly in Burkina Faso, they have the means by which to counteract that. Traore has realized quite correctly that the way you counteract the attacks by the reactionaries is by relying on the masses, by mobilizing them in the defense of this revolution, mobilizing them in terms of, like, doing the mass construction projects. And also, he's taken the correct position with regard to the Russian, Chinese, and other allies, which is that they want to trade with their allies. They want to, of course, gain from their experience, but also that they don't want to be subordinated by them. So this is a revolutionary and Pan-Africanist project, I would say, and we hope that the Sahel countries, so Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, but also Chad, and if we can, and arguably Guinea, can succeed in completely liberating themselves from French neocolonialism, then we could see the beginnings of, like, a genuine Pan-Africanist federation in the old French West Africa. Now that would be a truly revolutionary moment, and it's what the Pan-Africanist revolutionaries have wanted to see for years. And if it succeeds, then you will see a lot of the other remaining comprador regimes start to fall apart quite quickly afterwards, because these old regimes were all very weak. They were dependent upon the masses remaining inert and divided. And once you see a successful example of a living socialist or socialist inclined Pan-Africanist revolutionary movement, then the masses of places like Nigeria will be inspired. Think of what a socialist Pan-Africanist Nigeria could be. Think of the enormous human potential in Nigeria, a place with a rapidly growing population, with huge potential in terms of natural resources. Think of what a Pan-Africanist project, which stretched from the upper Sahel down to Nigeria, could be like. Economically, it could be hugely powerful. Allied with Russia, China, and Iran, it could mean the potential liberation of huge areas of Africa, the chasing out of the French and the British and the Americans once and for all. And all of these leaders will have learned very well about how to drive a good bargain with more powerful states, such as the Chinese and the Russians, who are, of course, non-imperialist powers. But Traore is completely correct to say we want allies, we don't want masters. So a hugely important development, and one we should all support, and one that we should also aid in whatever small way we can by relentlessly critiquing and exposing the lies of the imperialists and the lies of the war on terror period. All that bullshit they talked about, fighting terror and Islamic fundamentalism, they were the ones they were the primary movers behind it at all times and in all places. Right. S.W. Haster says, do you think China will avoid the fate of capitalist society, or do you think it will become like the US? You know, vanity, consumption, gaping inequality, cronyism, etc. Well, I would say that at the moment, the future is unwritten. And by that, I don't mean to duck out. But what I mean is the future of China, it will be decided by the struggle within China itself. China has certain strengths that have been that come from the revolutionary period and some from the period of reform and opening up in terms of technological progress. They also have significant challenges which need to be overcome. They have a bourgeoisie which has influence, even though it is somewhat controlled by the Communist Party of China. You have an economy that, while still certain elements of it are planned, certain large elements of it are subject to market relations. You have unemployment in China, and you have you have like strikes and labor disputes in China. So beyond that, though, I mean, those are all, I would say, as Lenin said, strikes in the period of the building of socialism, given that there are contradictions, given that there is a capitalist class present, strikes of workers whilst the building of socialism goes on aren't actually unusual. And in China, as far as the information I can get hold of goes, what I can see is that most of them are actually settled in favor of the workers. And the upsurge in class struggle after 2007, 2008 actually pushed the Chinese party back over to a more radical position than it had occupied previously. And that's why you see the Xi Jinping leadership and all that and the sort of slightly more radical turn than it represents. But China will have to get over a number of problems, which include the fact that a lot of their intelligentsia were trained either in the West or using like American or European or British methods. A lot of their economists were, of course, trained only in Western bourgeois economic thought. There are Marxist-Leninist economists in China, of course, but that's a minority of people. The bulk of the intelligentsia aren't. A lot of the Chinese intelligentsia still routinely looks to the West as a matter of course, and there's still significant economic ties between the Chinese bourgeois and the US imperialists. So this is a struggle which is active and ongoing. But I would say it will be decided largely by the class dynamics in China, but also by the wider struggle. You see, it's no coincidence that as US imperialism intensified its hostility and its attacks on countries it couldn't completely control, and as the US-led global system went into a nosedive after 2008, you saw class struggle intensify in China, and that be reflected back in the CPC itself. So the Yang Zemin Hu Jintao period, which saw the significant strengthening of the comprador elements in China, that period passed away, and you've seen the emergence of a more, shall we say, nationalist-minded, slightly more revolutionary-minded leadership, or elements of the leadership in China since then. But more than that, you see that what goes on in China will be influenced by things like the Russian special military operation, the weakening of the European imperialist countries, the literal decline and fall of US imperialism, the intensification of struggles against imperialism in Africa. All of this will reflect back into China itself and reflect itself back into domestic Chinese class struggles. So the biggest influence will be, though, again, primarily domestic, but also the struggles within the imperial core nations will reflect back into China. If the Chinese, even like the pro-Western intelligentsia, sees revolutions break out in perfidious Albion or the United States, even though that seems a very distant prospect at the moment, it will inevitably have a knock-on effect within China itself. Seeing if you are concerned about imperialist influence, capitalist influence in China, then the best thing you can do is to work for the revolution in your homeland, because with the end of the imperialist system run out of London and Washington, then that will mean the end of their allies in the non-imperialist countries and the strengthening of the revolutionary forces there. See, all these things are connected together. If you want to see the triumph of socialism in other parts of the world, then work for the triumph of socialism in your part of the world. These things were connected together 100 years ago. I mean, look at the explosion in revolutionary forces that occurred once the Bolsheviks had broken the chain of imperialism at its weakest link in Russia. Similar things will happen in the coming years. There will be a global upsurge of revolution, just as there will be an upsurge regionally in all the way across Africa. If the Sahel states are successful in throwing off French neocolonialism and defeating their jihadist mercenaries, you'll see like a huge upsurge across Africa of like socialistic pan-Africanist projects. And if the imperial core nations and the ruling classes in the imperial core nations are overthrown, that will have a gigantic impact. Every struggle is now no longer local, hasn't been for over a century. It's a interconnected series of struggles which bounce off each other and feed off each other. Nothing is isolated. So we should bear that in mind. Okay. Dan asks, could China and Russia end the slaughter in Palestine on the spot if they really wanted? Well, let's deal with the theory first and then come to the practice. In theory, could China and Russia end the US-Israeli murder campaign in Gaza? Even in the realm of the theoretical, I would say it would be tremendously difficult for them to do so. Now, in the realm of the theoretical, the Chinese or the Russians could say that you stop right now or we'll nuke Tel Aviv. But then that would immediately invite the US to say, well, if you do that, then we'll nuke Moscow and Beijing. Because you're not just dealing with Israel. This is the problem. The idea, if Israel was just acting on its own, it could not do anything here. it could not carry out the slaughter of the Palestinians. It could not carry this on for as long as it has, unless it was being quartermastered by the US and others as well, Britain, France, and Germany, etc. So even if they threatened to nuke Tel Aviv or something, again, you wouldn't be making a threat to Israel. You'd be making a threat to US imperialism, which would immediately respond in kind. So could they then say, well, we will dispatch troops to stop it? Well, then you would invite, again, the response would come from US imperialism that they will be, that means war with them. So, because this is the Israel question is one that is, if it is not existential for the United States, it is close to it, because the end of Israel would mean the end, as again Hassan Nasrallah correctly pointed out, it would mean the end of British and American influence in West Asia, and it would mean the end also of various comprador regimes. So military threats are not practical at all. Now, what about economic threats? And here there is some valid criticism to be directed at the Chinese and the Russians. The Russians post counter-revolution have had a very dubious relationship with the Israeli regime. There is a lot of crossover between the Russian bourgeois, certain elements in the Russian bourgeois, and Israeli bourgeois. There's a lot of Russian speakers inside Israel. There was in the 90s a significant pro-Zionist element within the Kremlin, and this carried on over into the Putin period as well. And so there was at least a very close relationship between certain elements in the Russian ruling class and state and the Israeli regime. So that is, if you want to criticize the Russians, that is a valid criticism to be raised. They aligned themselves with the Zionist state for a considerable period of time due to the huge influence that the Russian Zionist lobby had within the Russian government. That influence has diminished over time because as the crisis of world imperialism has intensified, the role of the Israeli regime has become more and more crystal clear, particularly when they started supplying weaponry to the Kiev regime, and Israeli mercenaries started showing up on the front lines in Ukraine. That damaged the relationship significantly, and I don't think there's any going back now. But there is still, that relationship still does exist. The influence of the Zionists in Russia, though diminished, is still there. So that's a big potential criticism of the Russians, that in the post counter-revolution period, that there was a significant pro-Zionist element emerged inside Russia, which is still there, connected to a Russian Zionist element inside the state of Israel. So that's a valid criticism. As for the Chinese do a lot, have done and continue to do, as far as I can tell, a lot of business inside Israel, with Israel. So that in itself is a valid criticism, because the Chinese say a lot of things criticizing Israel, but they maintain their trade relations. So again, the only way that's going to be solved is by pressure coming from within China itself, because I think, as far as I'm aware, it's mostly private entities that trade that trade in Israel. Chinese private entities that trade in Israel. But even so, the Chinese government could cut that off if they wanted to. The reason why they don't is because there are significant bourgeois interests in China that profit off that trade. So one can make a criticism there, and should do. And again, it betrays the internal contradictions within the Chinese system. Now, there are those who go too far with this and say, oh my God, the Chinese could stop it tomorrow if they wanted to. No, I don't think they could. Even if the Chinese cut off all their trade with Israel and kicked out the Israeli ambassador, say, we don't recognize this state anymore, even if the Russians did the same, it wouldn't end the genocide in Gaza tomorrow. It might do some damage, and I would support both countries doing that. And that's something that I hope that people inside Russia and China are pushing for. But it wouldn't stop the genocide. It's false to say that that would. The only thing that would reliably stop the genocide is if Israel was cut off from the US. That's the only thing that would stop it. To answer Jay Coburn, why aren't Russia and China sending joint naval flotillas with humanitarian aid to Gaza? For the same reason they're not making military threats. Because again, you do that, that's a direct conflict with the United States. Because you're not just you're not dealing with Israel. Israel is just a proxy here. You're dealing with the US. Yes, Netanyahu and his gang are the ones who are pulling the trigger, who are doing the murdering. But it's the US imperialists that are calling the shots. So if you want to end the genocide, well, then pressure has to be brought to bear in a serious way on US imperialism itself. They're the ones who are underwriting it. They're the ones who are arming it. They're the ones who are Israel's ultimate master. And same is true to a much lesser extent these days, but an important extent in Britain, France, Germany. It's the imperial bloc that's doing this. And yes, you can criticize the Russians and the Chinese for not going far enough, but it is completely untrue to say that they could stop it tomorrow. That's not true. That is incorrect. Now, the other one, of course, who is important in this equation is that a certain resident of Ankara, a certain Mr. Erdogan. Like, he is another foul rat who, again, he is just a servant fundamentally of US and British imperialism for all his neo-Ottoman pretensions. But he's another one who is absolutely crucial for maintaining US and British control in West Asia. So he's another important element in US imperialist control over the West Asian region. And until the Turkish regime, which poses as the sort of big time nationalists, but in reality are big time compradors, I would say, till that regime is brought down and replaced, then again the reactionary the power of the US in the region will continue to be significant because it's based fundamentally on a series of alliances. The Israeli regime being the central one, the Turkish regime being another one, the Saudis and the Gulf states being part of that, as is the Jordanian regime. See, without these alliances, the US couldn't project power into the region. They don't have enough men. They don't have enough of an industrial base. It's all dependent upon keeping these various different compradors in power that allow the US to project power without having to expend vast amounts of blood and treasure in doing so. So there is my rather elongated answer. It's not as simple as it looks, basically. And always bear in mind, you are not going to war with Israel. You are going to war with the United States. And that's a different proposition. For all the United States has been weakened, for all that it has significant problems, for all that it probably couldn't sustain a stand-up fight for very long with either Russia or China, it's still got a significant amount of power. It is still dangerous. And the Russians and the Chinese are very cautious. This doesn't make the sights and the horrors coming out of Gaza any better. But I would always call for the comrades to think clearly about every situation. So let's carry on. Mohammed asks, can you and Kit invite Brazilian political economist Alfredo Saad Filho He will challenge some of the points you've made. PT had the support of the national bourgeoisie, but hated by pro-US comprador. Well, I'll have to look up. Send me an email with that guy's name in it, Mohammed, and if you could, anything that he's written, and I'll happily take a look at it. Marius says Thomas Cole made these paintings as a warning against Andrew Jackson, who he feared as a potential Caesar figure. He was an adamant American Whig. Interesting. Didn't know that. I will make a note of it. Hello to NNNMM from Bosnia and Herzegovina. He says, recently spoke to a Brazilian comrade studying medicine in the Balkans. He didn't like my praise of Stalin, but praised Allende. Guess he didn't read the history to the end. No, evidently not. Walter says, I'm pretty sure I've seen some of these paintings in media related to Gibbon's decline and fall. You probably have. Marius says that Cole saw the wars of conquest against the Native Americans in Mexico as the seeds of the US Republic's doom. Well, he may well have been right. Oh, by the way, I banned somebody from the chat. So if you're watching Mystery Man, the reason why I banned you from the chat was that you were acting like a total cock. Debate, fine. Questioning, fine. But belligerent foolishness is not tolerated. You carry on like that, you get the boot. And there's no appeal, by the way, either. So think very carefully before you type. And don't come in here getting overly emotional, because if you do, then you will be shown the door. Thank you and good night. So, Edward says, it feels like if a state elite decides to abolish the dictatorship of the proletariat and privatize, they just do it. China, USSR, Eastern Europe, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, etc. Only DPRK is planned economy. Well, I would disagree with you slightly. With what you say there, Edward, because if the purely pro-capitalist group in China had got all their own way, then China would have gone the way of the USSR by 1991. So evidently they didn't get it all their own way. There's still significant parts of the Chinese economy are planned. I mean, let's go back to what we were discussing last night, which is is it merely the presence of markets or even the presence of inequality that rules whether a state is on the path to socialism or not? I would also say, by the way, even the Chinese don't claim they're at socialism yet. The line expressed by Xi Jinping is that they want a moderately prosperous socialist society by 2050, and they're not there yet. It's an interesting way of phrasing it. So, but the point about China is that there has always been a active opposition to the pro-market, pro-privatization wing, the Dengist wing. There's always been those who oppose that. And they retained a significant influence within the party after 1989 and all the way up to the present day. And their influence has grown. And also, looking at various intellectual pieces of intellectual output in China related to the Chinese party, certainly I would say that the quality of their analysis has improved over the years. It's gone back towards a more revolutionary position. So I don't think it's fair to say that that China's just gone into, it's just a purely capitalist society, because that's not the case. It's certainly, but the problem one of the problems that I see, the potential problems that I see, is that due to the balance of forces within the Chinese party at the moment, the Chinese party retains this sort of post-cultural revolution aversion to the expression of the truth as a truth of Mao's thought, which is that the class struggle intensifies after the revolution, and that there would need to be class struggle for many years before the proletariat was fully ready to actually exercise its dictatorship, and actually you start to see the potential for the move away from a typical form of the state towards communism, and that takes a long time. And the one of the central problems of revisionism, Soviet or Chinese or Vietnamese, is the denial of that truth. Now, that truth exists whether the party acknowledges it or not. There is always class struggle going on in socialist societies, whether the leadership acknowledges it or not. The class struggle in China itself was beneficial, I would say, to the further development of the Chinese Revolution and the further development of the Chinese Party in getting over the most negative aspects of Dengism after 2008. So the class struggle is constant, whether you would have it or not. Now, would I prefer that everywhere looked a bit more like the DPRK? Well, yeah, but that's not my choice. That is going to be down to the struggle within those countries. Now, what our job as Westerners, especially for those of us, unlike you, Edward, you're a resident in one of the in I believe you're Lithuanian. Those of us in the imperial core nations need to play our part in reviving revolutionary parties here, and our job when it comes to the actually existing socialist states is to support them when they come under attack from imperialism, which they will all do or have done already, and to dispel the lies in the press here about them. And but the biggest thing for us to do is to, of course, work to overthrow the ruling classes here. Hello to DJ Darkside. HM says, what do you make of Paul Embry? Not very much. I think he's a Zionist trying to be the left-wing Farage. Yeah, well, the right-wing Farage isn't doing particularly well at the moment either. Embry is like a old school Labour Party right-winger who got a certain degree of notoriety a while back because he published a book, some of which had certain truths in it about how the British left is very middle class and hates the working class, and that's true. But basically, his version of politics is essentially like old school Labour right wing, meaning that he isn't particularly fond of class struggle either. Bear in mind, this guy's an old Fire Brigades Union bureaucrat. He was something of a trade union radical back in the day, not anymore. Basically, what he wants is a return to like the kind of social democracy of like the 1950s. Having read his book, I would say he has no understanding of what British imperialism is, or doesn't want to understand it. What he wants is for the British ruling class to essentially make a few concessions and revive British social democracy. In reality, Paul Embry is not that much different to Jeremy Corbyn. There is a dispute between the two of them over immigration. I wouldn't say it's even that much of one. So, yeah, he's just another social democrat, but one who's a bit more openly right-wing. Hilariously, by the way, Nigel Farage has gone woke recently. This is a very interesting and very funny development, and confirms certain things that, like, I've heard about Farage. Like, he recently, before now, he's been running on the idea that he's the big anti-woke guy. But he launched this campaign about, Britain is dying under a tidal wave of crime yesterday. And he was asked about putting men in women's prisons, which is a big controversy, rightly so here. And rather than just say the line that his supporters expected him to say, which is that there should be no men put in women's prison, which is, by the way, is correct. He sort of waffled and wavered and says, depends on the risk assessment, blah, blah, blah. So Nigel's gone woke now. Nigel's now pro putting men in women's prisons, which is a really interesting twist for him to take at this stage, given that the Reform are 5 to 6% at least ahead in most polls. They look certain if the election was held tomorrow and the polls are in any way accurate, they would come out as the single largest party. So why make this concession now? Interestingly enough, this is part of a broader maneuvering by Farage to make himself completely acceptable to the British ruling class. British ruling class are all still, I would say, very much invested in the transgender psyop, and so they have been exerting pressure on Farage to fall in line. And he's fallen in line not just on this, but if you look at the opinions he expressed 10 years ago about the coup in Kiev, the bringing to power of the Kiev regime, the beginning of the Ukrainian civil war, he was actually saying things that were quite critical of the policies of the EU and the US. Now, since he got within a sniff of power, he's now completely aligned himself with the current position of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is we must not give in to the evil Putin. His statements on it now sound exactly like Keir Starmer's. See, this is what happens whenever anybody gets near power. You're called in for a chat by the people who represent real power in Britain. You're told, well, we think you should do this, this, and this, and if you do this, this, and this, then we can have a very productive relationship, Mr. Farage, and you get to be Prime Minister. Oh, bloody God, would have been his response. So Nigel is going woke, but you can expect him also to make a series of concessions over migration. And so what you will get from Nigel on migration is performative clampdowns, reactionary pronouncements, whipping up of racism, and the ruling class being able to bring in as many workers as they like. Because that's what you're required to do. If you're going to hold the office of British Prime Minister, you're required to dance to whatever tune the ruling class is playing. Nigel will do that for them. Tom Wolfe says the USSR thought the Israeli state would be progressive. In the 1940s, yes. I would say that was something that the Zionists very much sold. That vision didn't last very long, though. Let's just scroll through here. Hot Channel says Shadow Fleet just means ships that aren't insured by London. That is correct. Let's just go through. A lot of discussion of the nature of China. We should probably just do an hour on that at some stage soon. Hello to Yuan in Phoenix, Arizona. Tom Wolfe says land in Britain is owned by the church, monarchy, and big investors. That is correct. Church, monarchy, corporations own the land here. What else have we got here? Pavel asks, how do you see the risk of Western imperialist governments using armed drones against their own population? I would say it's very much a risk. I am doubting at least the industrial capacities of Europe to provide this. Well, they can produce a certain amount of drones, which will primarily be used for domestic repression. The risk, to my mind, has always been with this technology that they will use it to keep control of their own population. When it becomes more and more obvious that they can't actually challenge effectively the Chinese, the Russians, or Iran, the only place left for the only move for them to make is to increase the amount of domestic repression. So yes, if they face serious uprisings in the United States or Britain, they'll use every weapon at their disposal if they feel like they're going to lose control. Drones, death squads, militarized police forces. Like, why do you think the US policing system is so completely and utterly militarized? It's because they are ultimately preparing for a domestic revolt. That's the reality of it. Do like tiny sheriff's departments in the middle of Nevada or somewhere really need tanks and armed personnel carriers? No. Is it just a grift to move money around? Well, partly, but also it represents an underlying fear that there are some in the ruling class and amongst their strategists who understand very well that ultimately they have no choice but to continually attack the living conditions of the domestic working class, and that eventually is going to lead to a revolt. So they're preparing as many armed forces as they possibly can to repress this when it breaks out. That's been the move for decades now. It's why, again, it's a permanent policy. No matter who's in office at the local, state, or federal level in the United States, the police forces are continually militarized, and they will use armed drones. They will use. I mean, there's already a history in the U.S., for instance, of them using aerial bombardment on domestic populations. So, for instance, the bombing of the MOVE building, I believe it was Philadelphia in 1985. That's one such example. I mean, that was at a lower level of technology. So, of course, they'd use an armed drone. If there was a movement in the United States that threatened them, they'd use every means at their disposal to destroy it. And if it was really threatening, well, they'd send in the army. They've done it before. And to pick up on what S.W. Haster says in the chat, yeah, there's a reason why US police forces are sent for training with the IDF. It's because this is what the US police forces will ultimately be used for, which is essentially counterinsurgency against the US domestic population. Israel is a laboratory through which the US develops or co-develops technologies of repression. And everything you're seeing done to the Palestinians now will ultimately be done to restive populations in the imperial core nations. That's one of Israel's key values, one of Israel's key aspects, which the US wants to preserve, which is the ability to test repression methods in there without any accountability. Right, moving on. Who do the French think they're fooling? Well, their own population, most likely. Breeze says China just barely broke away from the globalists when the left the Hu Jintao period and entered the Confucian Renaissance of Xi. Interesting. I mean, certainly the comprador element was much stronger in the Yang, Zemin, and Hu Jintao period than it is now. It's still there, though. Sid says, I believe we will see China transform to a full-on socialist economy when the rest of the world moves in that direction. China can only go so far existing in a world economy wherein the other countries are all capitalist. A lot of people I live around don't understand China exists. Well, that's not a surprise. If you're from anywhere in the West, the education systems here are not exactly brilliant. David King says, here, Apple stores closing in China. Chinese refusing to buy US goods. Yeah. S.W. Haster says, or asks rather, what do you think is the reason for China to continue to trade with Israel, who is committing open genocide? I thought China would at the very least stop trade with Israel. Well, I've spoken about that already. I think it's down to various interests that exist within the Chinese bourgeoisie and an unwillingness on behalf of the Chinese government to take on those interests. I think if there was a significant move from the base, from workers in China to demand that, then that would happen. As I said before, that would have a better chance of happening. Lisa says, I've wondered how US officers and other service members feel about CEOs becoming lieutenant colonels with no military background. Well, they probably hate it, but it does reflect the bourgeois nature of the military, which is that they bring people in at officer level who are rich. That's always been the case with certain bourgeois militaries. But the rank and file soldiers probably absolutely hate it. Chandler asks, why was Chinese foreign policy so misguided following the Sino-Soviet split, i.e. supporting the Khmer Rouge over revolutionary Vietnam? I think that what went on there was like a living proof that the ultra-leftist deviation is in reality a rightist one, or that the two are very much intertwined with each other. The Chinese analysis of the Soviet Union made some very, very bad mistakes, and concluding, perhaps understandably, given the attitude of the Khrushchevite revisionists towards China, the whole thing about social imperialism, about the Soviet Union being a social imperialist power, was a mistake. The conclusions that were drawn from that faulty analysis led the Chinese to do things like, as you say, Chandler, support the Khmer Rouge. It also leads to the very reactionary policy of the known as the Free Worlds policy, which is how they justified backing not just the Khmer Rouge, but like Jonas Savimbi in Angola, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, openly collaborating with US imperialism, opening relations with apartheid South Africa. That's something that happened. So the Chinese foreign policy, and it can't all be pinned on Deng Xiaoping either. This started before he became the primary and most influential leader. So it started under the ultra-left period of the Cultural Revolution. It was one of the biggest errors of the Cultural Revolution, was this very, very, very poorly theorized analysis of the Soviet Union as a social imperialist power, some of which, by the way, they shared with Enver Hoxha, who also got it disastrously wrong. So in the case of the Cultural Revolution and everything that happened there, the ultra-left deviation became a right-wing one. And they ended up doing all kinds of reactionary shit in the field of like foreign policy. And that didn't that sort of ended with didn't really end actually until relatively recently. But yes, it was proof that the Cultural Revolution had all kinds of faulty analysis within it, and the social imperialist conclusion about the USSR was a huge error, which, as far as I'm aware, and I'm prepared to be, I may be wrong about this. As far as I'm aware, they've never properly analyzed it or rectified it or addressed why they were wrong, because the Deng Xiaoping criticized, of course, the Gang of Four and what he called the ultra leftists of that period, but they maintained the Cultural Revolution era foreign policy into the Deng Xiaoping era, proving that ultra-leftism and rightism are very much the same thing. Breeze says China and Russia aren't going to enter into an existential war beyond the SMO unless necessary, because they're winning by virtue of production. Very true. The inability of the US to reshore its own military production supply lines shows that the US couldn't win a war with China even if it tried. I mean, they may try and mobilize the Taiwanese and the Filipinos or the Japanese against the Chinese, but I don't think that's going to work either. All right. What's your take on Richard Murphy's Politics of Care and Gary's Economics? Richard Murphy, again, interesting, pulls in some interesting information in his research. His political conclusions are just warmed over Keynesianism, though. And Politics of Care is one of those things that's like an unbearable soc dem NGO nonsense politics. So I have no time for the man's political conclusions whatsoever. Some of the information he digs up, though, is quite useful to draw from. Gary's Economics, not read enough of it to give you a firm opinion. We'll have to check it out. Pavel says, in Western Europe, it looks like fascism is approaching fast, and we don't currently have enough communist cadre and not enough people who pose the honest why question. Fascism seems likely. Well, if we were actually into fascism, Pavel, would be perversely in a better situation, because they turn to outright fascism. What you're seeing is basically like liberal regimes becoming more and more Bonapartist. You're not seeing a transition to fascism at the moment because the workers' movement doesn't pose enough of a threat. So they're moving, yes, to more and more repressive techniques, but we're not at fascism yet, precisely because the workers' movement doesn't pose a threat. They are not banning. They're not doing mass banning of trade unions yet, because again, not significant enough of a threat is posed. It can be dealt with within the existing repressive legal confines of the liberal state. Fascism will rear its head properly as a serious force when class struggle intensifies. Because when class struggle intensifies, I mean, this is the reason why they keep fascists around and on the payroll, so they can mobilize them and build organizations quickly when the working class recovers a fighting capacity. And that's what will happen in the near future. You'll see an increased amount of class struggle, followed by the fascists suddenly being very well funded and very well organized, and probably with a lot of ex-military types in their ranks as well, which is why we need to prepare. But we're not there yet, but we will get there when the class struggle intensifies, because the ruling class will quickly turn to fascism as they realize that their ordinary methods of control don't work anymore. Caustic Grip says most anti-Putin Russian intelligentsia are of Jewish descent. In fact, a lot of them went to Israel at the beginning of the SMO. And if I were Russian, I would say that they are more than welcome to stay there and never come back, because those who left Russia to protest against the special military operation, like Anatoly Chabayes, who ended up in Israel, these wretches tried to turn Russia into a neo-colony of the United States and Britain. And if I were Russian, I would say good riddance and don't fucking come back. Mark Puglisi says, wasn't it the Russian Jews, Avigdor Lieberman, etc.? He's Moldovan, I believe, by nationality. The ones that pulled Israel even further to the right. Only to the they weren't the ones that started the process. They're part of it. Like every wave of migration has been more militantly genocidal, basically, because that's the only way the Israeli state can keep itself stabilized, is by expanding. And for expansion, you need a certain breed of scumbag, and you need a certain kind of fanatic who's prepared to settle in lands or literally take somebody's house. You need a certain variety of scumbag who's shameless enough to do that, and it produces a certain type of politics which is like fascistic. And so every wave of migration from the 60s onwards into Israel has promoted more and more openly fascistic forces, to the point where you now have Netanyahu, who looks like almost a moderate next to like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, which maybe is the point of having Ben Gvir and Smotrich around. So yeah, every wave of migration has been more and more secured a more and more reactionary type of politics, even more so than existed in Israel in the 60s. And that was pretty bad. But it's also conversely bound up with Israel's decay. Like the decay, for instance, in like the Israeli army's fighting capacity. Like there were Israeli retired officers complaining that the Israeli military was going rotten as early as their invasion of Lebanon in the early 1980s. And the Israeli army's performance in recent wars has only confirmed just how bad they really are. So this is something which is also worth bearing in mind. So as Israel has more and more waves of migration into it, its actual capacity to fight wars hasn't improved, it's decreased. Right. Moving through the comments here, I saw a question come in about yes, Caustic Grip says, does anyone know, did Hezbollah disarm themselves? No, they were given until 3 p.m. today, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, they were told to do that by essentially the US. They won't do it because the people who organize and run Hezbollah know very well that if they do that, then Lebanon itself will be completely dominated by the US, even possibly dismembered, even more than it is already. Now, the demand for Hezbollah to disarm has been a constant demand of the imperialists for like 20 plus years now. So it's not exactly a surprise that they've come back to this again. If they try and get the Lebanese army to forcibly disarm Hezbollah, though, they're going to have a fucking renewed civil war on their hands. And part of me thinks that, well, the US wouldn't be too opposed to that. If it ended up with Lebanon collapsing into a civil war, then that would be something that the US via Israel will be very, very, very happy about. So there's a very cynical game that's being played here, but I think that the Hezbollah aren't going to disarm. They know what the consequences will be if they did, and the US can't force them because they don't have the means to do it. Lebanon has a lot of problems, though, because of course it's has a sectarian constitution imposed on it by the imperialists. It's designed to be a dysfunctional sectarian state that barely holds together most of the time, and the only real national excuse me, the only real national liberation force there is, of course, Hezbollah, which is why the imperialists are demanding that they disarm, and also it's right why they won't. So this will continue. I wouldn't rule out the Israeli regime launching some kind of other attacks on Hezbollah, but bear in mind, every time the Israeli regime attacks Lebanon and saying it's going after Hezbollah's popularity actually increases, even outside of the Shia population of Lebanon. And as Alistair Page McGill points out in the chat, well, anywhere where the US has like a gigantic embassy, it's because they aspire to rule the place and seek to create as many problems as possible there. So this is like, if you see a construction going on for a gigantic US embassy in your country, you know you're in for some seriously bad news very soon. Arcane Eclectic says, I think the civil war is exactly what they want, just like Syria and Iraq. That may well be what they want, because if they can't control somewhere, they can at least reduce it to rubble, which is exactly the sort of cynical maneuver that I would expect from them. SWA says, Andrew Jackson had a whip made out of Native Americans and considered this his prized possession. Yeah, he was a 24-carat bastard, no doubt about that. Cooper Ward asks, could you elaborate on how transgenderism advocacy is degenerative to work or organization? I've done it multiple times before, but I'm happy to do it again, considering this thing keeps being pushed towards us by the ruling class. Yeah. Nico didn't realize that the YouTube displayed the stupid username. Yeah, a lot of people get caught out by that. Right. Should communists make building or rebuilding the middle class part of their propaganda? Asks President Jesus. I would say that what we should be doing is not playing into ruling class propaganda. Given that this is you are an American asking a question about the United States, the way in which the term middle class has been used traditionally in the United States has been to try and basically deny the existence of the working class and deny the existence of class contradictions in the US. That's why you see Obama or Bush or Clinton saying, "Well, I'm here to support our hard-working middle class." The idea being that America was beyond class contradictions. So what we should actually be doing is being honest with American workers about the situation. Most American workers probably understand their situation far better than we do, given that they can see how poorly off they are and how that is getting worse. I don't think we should be playing the game of saying we will rebuild the middle class, because like what you're basically saying is that what we'll do is restore post World War II like Rooseveltian style social democracy, which isn't going to be possible in the immediate period, I would guess, after a revolutionary transformation begins inside the United States. This is the problem that we face, and the British left does this all the time with promising basically a return to welfare capitalism. What we're going to be faced with is the need for a revolutionary transformation, a rapid rebuilding of the means of production that have been destroyed by the decay brought about by the imperialist ruling classes in Britain and the United States. And that's going to mean an awful lot of work and self-sacrifice by all of us if the revolution breaks out tomorrow or something. I don't think pandering to the delusions about the welfare capitalist past is particularly productive. The first rule, I would say, for communists is to call things accurately for what they are. So don't pander to like the bourgeois designations or bourgeois labels which are used to mask class contradictions inside the United States. So don't go around saying we're going to restore the middle class. That's like a line from Bill Clinton, or Obama, or even George W. Bush. Like, this is nonsense. This shouldn't be engaged in. Call things what they are, and if that means that, it'll take slightly longer to get through to the majority of to a lot of American workers who are far gone on like anti-communist propaganda, well, then so be it. It's better to recruit smaller numbers and to build a solid core with a reliable understanding about what the nature of American capitalism is, than to have some kind of organization which is all over the place and trying to take a little bit of Rooseveltian social democracy, trying to take a little bit of something else and merge it together and call it, Jeffersonism for the 21st century or something like that. We have to start by accurately describing things. That's the thing. Slumbering Colossus asked, do you believe it likely an armed insurgents will develop once the economy tanks further? I don't want to make, though, in the United States. Difficult to say at this stage. I mean, again, like, I have a certain amount of awareness about the political developments in the United States. I'm not able to read exactly into where the mood of the masses is because I'm not there on the ground. What I would say, though, is that at every stage we need to carefully assess, like, what are the possibilities for revolutionary struggle, and what is the correct path forward. We should not ever be dogmatic on our tactics. One of the worst things a lot of revolutionaries did post 60s was to get fixated on the idea that there was only one path forward. That it must be an insurrection like October 1917, or it must be Foucaultism, or it must be, protracted people's war, or it must be, on the other side of things, cautious reform via winning positions in bourgeois electoralism, long march through the institutions shit. The problem with all of those positions is the dogmatism. Like, it must be this way or no way. Whereas Lenin, Mao, and other great revolutionary leaders, no matter how they won the day in their countries, were always clear that you had to proceed from a careful analysis of facts on the ground, and like where the working class was in terms of consciousness. How powerful is the Revolutionary Party? How many reliable cadres does it have? What's the status of the bourgeoisie? How reliable are the bourgeois forces of the state in terms of carrying out repression? Is it possible to push things forward by standing for election, by using bourgeois elections? If that's possible, then how far should we go down that path? If it's not possible, then you need to look at other methods of struggle. So it needs to be a very careful evaluation based on the actual realities of the class struggle and the strength of the enemy, etc., the strength of our side, as to what tactics are used. So I would be very careful before saying that now it's time for urban guerrillaism. Everybody break out the Marighella right now, and let's go from there. So I think you need very careful analysis needs to be done before making prescriptions here. SW Hater says, I think this tariff policy will end disastrously for Americans. Do you think the US will go to war with China during the Trump administration? I don't think so. How do you see the legacy of Trump's second term? As disastrous as Biden's, to be honest. I would say that the tariff policy will not do what Trump said it was going to do. Trump said it was going to lead to a revival of American industry. That will not happen, because Trump's tariff policy cannot force the US bourgeoisie to reinvest in manufacturing inside the United States. That's not what the tariff policy can do. And it will only raise prices for the working class. Essentially, it's another tax on the US workers. I'm surprised Biden didn't come up with it. Biden did keep Trump's steel tariffs, though, it should be said. So as to the orange Gibbons legacy, about the same as Biden's, which is another failed attempt to turn around the fortunes of US imperialism. Trump is unable to end the war in Ukraine. He can't do that. Trump is unable to address the decline of domestic manufacturing. Can't do that. The only thing Trump's going to do is, again, following on from his first term, which is he will try and juice the stock market, drive up stock prices, claim that maybe do a tax cut, claim that he's done some great and amazing thing, follow up with cuts to Social Security and other things, and claiming he's making America great again as the stock market price continues to climb. That's the only policy he's going to have. Look at who he's surrounded himself with. Like people like Howard Lutnick or Scott Bessent. These are all like Wall Street sharks. What do you think the policy is that they'll be suggesting? Mr. President, cut regulation, allow Wall Street to do whatever it likes, develop policy that basically juices stock prices. Then that'll create like it did in his first term, something of like a sugar rush in the US economy before it crashes down again. And that's why Trump's getting mad about the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which may well be offering inaccurate information. But it's why Trump gets mad whenever he's contradicted, because there is no economic revival in the United States, just as there wasn't under Obama either. I mean, under Obama, you got a revival of what? A boost of employment on temporary and short-term contracts, like a boost of casualization of labor. Under Trump, you got like juicing stock prices. Under Biden, you got an attempt to make things, to do industrial policy by just throwing endless fucking subsidies at the capitalist class. So it's more of the same. Like every president since 2008 faced with like the stagnation and decline of US manufacturing, has just tried all the same things: tax cuts, deregulation, cuts to spending on that benefited the US working class, trying to boost stock market prices, and that's about it. Trump's going to do the same. Every single move they've got is just dictated by the interests of the US ruling class, and that's all the US ruling class wants to see. So that's all you're going to get. So, okay, so we are approaching the 2-hour mark, so I'm going to draw things to a close for today. Thanks to all 377 of you watching at the moment. I will return to you tomorrow with more. So we can also, to answer a question that was popped up earlier, yes, next week we're going to be bringing back the Debunking Anti-Communism series, so keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye out for Decline and Fall show, at least one of those coming up this week. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow, but until then, here's your outro.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.